نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا وشفيعنا ومولانا محمد صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم رسوله النبي الأمين المكين الحنين الكريم الرؤوف الرحيم. أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قال الله تعالى في شأن حبيبه إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد كما تحب وترضى بأن تصلي عليه. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قال رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي واجعل لي وزيرا من أهلي هارون أخي اشدد به أزري وأشركه في أمري كي نسبحك كثيرا ونذكرك كثيرا. صدق الله العظيم وبلغنا رسوله النبي الكريم ونحن على ذلك لمن الشاهدين والشاكرين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Most respected ulama, my respected elders, brothers and sisters in Islam, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. The recent massacre of the Ikhwan pro-Morsi supporters 2 days ago, 3 days ago, obviously provoked a great deal of anger and a lot of political backlash from various leaders of the world. And various leaders of the world, including the superpowers like America and so on, expressed their condemnation at these very, very tragic events and so on, albeit very, very politically and diplomatically. And we won't get into the analysis of their responses and whatever it is. But based on what has happened in the past 2 or 3 days, my topic for discussion today is on Morsi is not Musa. And it's going to be an analysis from a historical perspective as well as a religious perspective of the current conflict in Egypt and what lessons can be learned not only for the people of Egypt and the governing people, the governing forces of Egypt, but also for the greater Muslim community with regards to future political leadership as well. If we look at Egypt itself from the Quranic perspective, Egypt has a very rich Quranic history. And when we look and analyze the current conflict in Egypt, and if you refer to the historical context in the Holy Quran, you will notice that Egypt's history with regards to the Quran is a very, 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 very intricate one and intimate one as well. One Nabi of Allah was appointed to perhaps the most highest of positions of authority in the governorship and in the rule of Egypt. And that was Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam. He said, قال أجعلني على خزائن الأرض. He said, appoint me as the person responsible for the treasury of the people. خزائن الأرض. إني حفيظ عليم. Verily I am someone that will safeguard it, and I'm a knowing safeguarder, and I'm a trustworthy person. So Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam was appointed a very high ministerial position in the governance of Egypt. And he was responsible primarily at a very crucial stage in Egypt's history when Egypt and the Egyptian people were suffering from famine. So in order to safeguard the people, safeguard the health of the people, safeguard the wealth of the people of Egypt, as well as to maintain administrative balance, Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam took on the task of the responsibility from a political level and a management level of the affairs of the people of Egypt. That's Quranic history. Then you have a second Nabi of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the form of Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, who took on the guise or took on the responsibility of being a liberator for the people of Egypt, to liberate the Bani Israel from the tyranny of Fir'aun. And the Holy Quran discusses this matter in detail as well, whereas Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu stood there as a freedom fighter, as a human rights activist, as a liberator against the highest tyrannical authority in the world at that time, who was Ramses II, as historians put it there, and he's referred to as Fir'aun in the Holy Quran. And this is where the history of the liberation struggle and the struggle for liberation in Egypt takes on a very, very interesting perspective, particularly from the Holy Quran. The Quran brings about a scenario, right, wherein Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala discusses the preconditions and the preparations of Musa alayhi salatu salam before he could take on the supreme so-called authority, who regarded himself as Ana Rabbukumul A'la, I am the Lord Most High, I am the chief sovereign authority, even more sovereign to the people than God himself, and that was Fir'aun. And this is where Morsi is not necessarily Musa. And it is interesting because if you know who Morsi is from a political perspective, I'm not here to discuss the politics of Egypt, I'm here to give it primarily from a religious and a historical perspective, right? You know that Mohammed Morsi and the dominant party there ideologically are part of the Islamic Brotherhood, Ikhwanul Muslimin. And they are fundamentally an ideological political movement, okay? And Mohammed Morsi is part of the Islamic Brotherhood. And if you know that some of the people who were instrumental and were the stalwarts of the Islamic Brotherhood, obviously the founder was Hassan al-Banna, right? But one of the greatest stalwarts and one of the most famous leaders of Muslim Brotherhood was Sayyid Qutb. And if you know Sayyid Qutb's readings like Fi Dhilal al-Quran and Ma'alim al-Tariq and so on, the milestones and whatever it is there, you will know Sayyid Qutb's liberation theology as it has been widely called now, right? It's interesting that Sayyid Qutb's very, very fundamental, one of his fundamental issues was the concept of Jahiliyyah, and he went to great pains to elucidate the concept of Jahiliyyah, which is glossed today in the English language as the term in ignorance. But Sayyid Qutb utilized the word Jahiliyyah by explaining it to be a ignorance of the guidance of God. Ignorance of the guidance of God is what is Jahiliyyah in a short explanation, right? And it's interesting that the very people who promoted Sayyid Qutb's thought and his ideology, and which was primarily this concept of Jahiliyyah, which is ignorance of the guidance of God, did not necessarily in their methodology take the guidance from God. Because Quran gives you a very beautiful narrative of the situation of Musa alayhi salatu before preparing to meet Fir'aun. And Quran says, قال, Musa alayhi salatu wasalam said, رَبِّ اشْرَحْ لِي صَدْرِي. He said, oh my Lord, expand my chest for me. This is not to be taken literally only, but symbolically and metaphorically, which the commentators of the Holy Quran says that he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant him sharh of sadr, the expansion of his breast, which symbolically means to grant him confidence, to grant him courage, and to grant him conviction. The 3 C's: confidence, courage, and conviction. And then he said, Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri, and make it easy my task for me. He asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the second thing, which was that in my negotiation and in my encounter with Fir'aun, who is the tyrannical authority, and it's interesting that according to some scholars, Fir'aun is the founding father of what we know today as the political ideology known as democracy. Demokratis, which is derived from Latin but previously from Greek, right? Demo means people, kratis means rule, the rule of people, the sovereignty of the people, and the sovereignty of the rule of the people is what democracy is all about, right? And this is what they are trying to now impose on Egypt, democracy. That's the coin, the term of the people now. Every government has to be a democracy. According to Islamic scholars, the first democrat or the first person to espouse democracy in his being and in his rule was Fir'aun. He's the father of democracy because he regarded himself as sovereign over and above the laws of the Almighty, right? Which is the very foundational basis of what we know today as democracy. The will of the people and the rule of the people, for the people, by the people. A government of the people, for the people, by the people. Right? Which is not in congruence and is not in harmony with Islamic values, because the sovereignty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala supersedes the sovereignty of any human being. This is what is fundamentally what we believe. Okay? So Musa alayhi salatu, when he's encountering Fir'aun, who is the superpower of the world, he prepares for it in what way? He says, expand my chest with courage, confidence and conviction. And then he says, make my task easy for me. وَحْلُلْ عُقْدَةً مِّن لِسَانِي, and then loosen the tongue on my tongue, the knot on my tongue, so that I may be able to articulate my perspective and I may be able to create a convincing argument and present my argument very, very clearly and concisely. So that يَفْقَهُ قَوْلِي, so that the people will be able to understand my viewpoint, be able to understand my perspective, and be able to appreciate where I'm coming from. Because he's going to enter into negotiations with Fir'aun. And then he took another step. He said, وَجَعَلْ لِي وَزِيرًا مِّنْ أَهْلِي. He didn't go it alone with the tyrannical superpower of the world. He sought an alliance. He sought a alliance. He said, وَجَعَلْ لِي وَزِيرًا مِّنْ أَهْلِي, and give me a helper, a helpmate from amongst my people. Harun, my brother. أَخِشْدُدْ بِهِ أَزْرِي. Give my brother Harun as my representative, as my partner, as my ally when I take on Fir'aun. Right? Harun أَخِشْدُدْ بِهِ أَزْرِي, and strengthen me through Harun. وَأَشْرِكْهُ فِي أَمْرِي, and let him be my help and my partner in my task. Let him share my task with me. كَيْ نُسَبِّحَكَ كَثِيرًا وَنَذْكُرَكَ كَثِيرًا, so that both of us may then glorify you and remember you often and frequently. Now, if we go through this analysis of Musa alayhi salatu's preparation before he could take on a supreme so-called superpower at that time, from a political perspective, you will see that the first thing Musa alayhi salatu asked for was for mental strength and resolve. First thing he asked for. The second thing that he asked for was to grant him a diplomatic tongue so that he will be able to enter into active and positive negotiations with his political foe, which at that time was Fir'aun. The third thing that he asked for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was that he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, grant me alliances, help me to create a network of people who will be able to support me. And the first person that he sought help from was from his own brother, Harun أَخِشْدُ بِهِ أَزْرِي. So meaning the people that were closest to him, he sought their help and he wanted to create a network of support for himself. Right? Finally, after all of that, he asked for his spiritual motivation, which was so that you make tasbih and the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, when we look at the present condition in Egypt and we look at the election of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood and their party and so on there, to the position of power and the subsequent, politically speaking, right, coup d'etat, which is illegal, right? And if we look at, we're not interested in getting into the politics. We're looking at primarily where did Islamic Brotherhood and and Morsi and so on, they falter in certain instances with regards to strategy and learning from the lessons of the Holy Quran. The first thing was that from a purely ideological perspective, if you look at the current situation in Egypt, as if you look at it historically as well, the one crucial error that was made by the Islamic Brotherhood, perhaps because of their ideological underpinnings, because if you know Sayyid Qutb's writings, right, he was not in favor of the clergy or the scholarly ulama as such. He was not in favor of them. He used to call them babaghatul manabir, the parrots of the pulpit, right, who were paid by the government, so they were government mouthpieces. And he had some justification in that. But it reached an extreme wherein he wanted nothing to do with the scholarly class or the Islamic clergy as it is, right? And he said that if we ever get into power, the first people that we'll get rid of will be these indolent so-called scholars, right, who do nothing and just expect a wage at the end of the month. So he was not in very much favor of them. And over a period of time, the people who followed his liberationist theology and so on, they also developed a type of dislike for the scholarly class or for the Islamic clergy as such. One thing that you didn't notice in Morsi's period of time, or in his period of time of governance, was the fact that there was no real outward overture to bring in the ulama, the scholarly class, into their government and make them part and parcel and partner with them to ensure that the ideals that the Ikhwan was working towards through Morsi and so on there would be achieved. This was a critical error, because if you look at the historical narrative of the history of Islam in Cairo, you will see from the Ottomans to the Mamluks, all of them engaged, in spite of them being governments and dynasties on their own, all of them engaged with the scholarly class or the Islamic clergy, and they allowed them to run the affairs, whether it was legal, educational, public health, social welfare and so on. It was social welfare and so on. It was always in the hands of the scholarly class. And they worked well with the government because they were involved in catering for the needs of the upliftment of the people. Whilst the government engaged in all so-called political matters. When we came to the upliftment, educational, legal, whether it was public health or whatever it is there, the fraternity of ulama historically dealt with those matters in Egypt up until today. Right? There was none of that we are aware of. There was some degree of alliance between them. Yet this is a Quranic directive. What did Musa alayhi salam say? Ya Allah, strengthen me with my brother. And who can be your greatest brother than the class of ulama? Because you are espousing the same ideals. Your methodology may differ, but the point is, he's still part of you. He still has the same ideals that you have. That was a critical error. The second thing was, Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, when he went on to take on Fir'aun, remember, when the Ikhwan came into power, the first thing they wanted to do was to make sweeping changes to the constitution and start bringing Sharia and Islamic law and so on there. Again, a critical error. Why? When the Quran, when Musa alayhi salatu asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through 7 processes to assist him in dealing with the tyrannical power which was known as Fir'aun, representing today, the Fir'aunic dynasties of democracy and so on there. Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him one more bit of advice. فَقُولَا لَهُ قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا لَعَلَّهُ يَتَذَكَّرُ أَوْ يَخْشَى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, O Musa, when you and Harun alayhi salatu wasalam enter into negotiations with Fir'aun, who now symbolizes a superpower of the world, don't do it in a manner which is going to, what's the word I'm looking for? Confrontational manner. Don't do it in a confrontational manner. Speak to him nicely. Because the tendency with tyrants is that the moment you take them on, right, they're going to become more belligerent. They're going to become more arrogant. They're going to take you on and say, who are you? We'll crush you and whatever it is. So the Quran gave him a directive. He said, use diplomatic speak. Use diplomatic language. Use that type of strategy, which will be a strategy of wisdom. Don't go and push for an Islamic constitution by pushing for Islam. Why do you need to do that? You don't need to turn Egypt into an Islamic state immediately. 94% or more than 97.4%, if I'm correct, of Egypt is Muslim anyway. They all follow and they all submit to the dictates of the Holy Quran and to the dictates of Sharia. So there's no need for you to turn it into an official state religion and now, almost like spiritualize the constitution. And you didn't need to do that immediately. You needed to fulfill the mandate that was required at that time, which was to deal with the crucial economic and socio-economic issues that were affecting the people at that given time. But typically, like the Taliban had done, they wanted to impose Sharia. It's not going to work. You can't deal with so-called democracies and superpowers of the world there and create the same type of rhetoric that, whatever the ideologies and ideals you espouse through the Ikhwan and so on there, now you are going to live out your dream through establishing Sharia overnight. Critical error. Critical error again. And the Quran gave directives to Musa alayhi salam, when you're dealing with Fir'aun, deal with him equitably. Talk to him in diplomatic language. And this is something that from the point of view of the strategy that was put across there, right, didn't come up very well with the rest of the powers that be around the world. These were issues. Now, if you look at all of this, and you look at the situation right now, right, it's going to be a vicious cycle of violence. It's no, it doesn't take Einstein to work this out. Really, did anyone really think that democracy would prevail in its classical concept in Egypt? No chance. The only so-called democracy that would have prevailed in Egypt would have been that democracy which the superpowers of the world would have, in one way or the other, fashioned and molded according to their requirements to fulfill the mandate, or so-called the mandate that they needed in Egypt. Because Egypt is a very strategic partner for the superpowers of the world currently with regards to their alliances with Israel. I mean, if you heard this morning's news there, Barack Obama stood up and said, the military exercise that we've been engaging in annually, that we engage in Egypt, we have suspended for a period of time. What does that tell you? Militarily, Egypt has always been in bed with America. It's the highest after Israel. By the way, Israel does not use the donations, from what I've heard, does not use the donations that America gives to them for its military support. Yet Egypt is entirely dependent on the $3 billion plus minus US dollars of US donations to be able to run its military. Really? Do you think they're going to allow anything to happen in Egypt which is going to upset the apple cart and upset that very, very, that very, very delicate balance that exists with the safeguarding and the sanctity of the so-called so-called state of Israel? It wasn't going to happen. And these things are things that, is political naivety on our part. If we really think that, when you put on these rose-tinted glasses and expect the superpowers of the world that be just to allow so-called democratic elections to take place there, no matter how much, what the ballot box may say, and no matter how narrow the margin may be, it wasn't going to happen. This should have been expected. Right? And now political analysts are coming back and say, well, maybe it was better off that, the guys who were fighting on the sidelines, they had the majority in parliament there, and we could have utilized that there to be able to work ourselves effectively. Now, coming back to the history of Egypt itself, I started off with Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam and Musa alayhi salatu wasalam standing there as a liberator for the people of Egypt. Right? But if you look at the history itself, Amr ibn al-As radiallahu ta'ala, who is a Sahabi Rasul, was the first so-called Islamic conqueror of Egypt. Okay? And there's a very important lesson to be learned from the era of Amr ibn al-As radiallahu ta'ala, which is not only most applicable to Egypt today, as it is to the rest of the world, Muslim world out there. There's an incident which is mentioned that when Amr ibn al-As, who was the conqueror of Egypt, went to Egypt, his son also obviously went with him, his family went with him, he was the governor of Egypt at the time. His son entered into a race with an Egyptian person. Remember, all the Egyptians were not Muslims, and they had just entered into Islam after the conquest of Egypt by Amr ibn al-As radiallahu ta'ala anhu. So obviously the vast majority of the people that the Muslims had now conquered were non-Muslims who were slowly entering into the fold of Islam. When he conquered Egypt, the youngster raced an Egyptian. And the Egyptian happened to beat the son of Amr ibn al-As in the race. So this young man, right, son of the governor, son of the conqueror, took out his whip, that they use for the horses all while there, and he whipped that Egyptian silly. And he said, خُذْهَا فَإِنِّي ibn al-akramain. He said, take this from me, because I am the son of the honored ones. Okay? He was whipped black and blue by the son of the president. I'm just using the term. Okay? The Egyptian goes from Egypt, goes to Medina, and he goes to Amirul Mu'mineen, Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And he presents himself in the court of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And he presents his case. Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu immediately summons Amr ibn al-As, Sahabi, conqueror of Egypt, governor of Egypt, and his son to the Darul Khilafah in Medina. When they finally come, Umar ibn al-Khattab asks, Ayn al-Masri, where is the Egyptian? Call him here. Call him here. Bring him here. When he brings him here, Umar ibn al-Khattab takes out the whip and he said, Adribha. Hit him. Hit that young man. Hit him. Ibn al-Akramin, the son of the honored ones. Hit him and extract your revenge. The Egyptian went out there and extracted his revenge against the son of Amr ibn al-As, while the governor of Egypt, the conqueror of Egypt, is standing there and watching. Standing there and watching. And he can do nothing about it because Umar is the judge. Radiallahu ta'ala anhu. Umar is the judge. When he finished off, Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu then said, wait, I'm not done yet. Call Amr ibn al-As here, the governor of Egypt, the conqueror of Egypt. Call him here as well. Call him here as well. So the Egyptian is a bit confused. Now what's going on? He says, now whoop Amr ibn al-As. Because had it not been for the fact that this young man took advantage of you simply because he is the son of Amr ibn al-As. He misused and abused his authority by virtue of being the son of the governor. And he is as equally guilty as his son is. The Egyptian looked at this, he looked at this justice of Islam, and he said, no, ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, my qualm was with the son, not with the father. And he forgave the father, he overlooked it. But Umar ibn al-Khattab at that time, and this is a crucial lesson to be learned by the Egyptian people and by the Egyptian leadership, whoever they may be. What Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala taught the conqueror of Egypt, Amr ibn al-As, and he asked him one single question which subsumes the whole ethic of Islam and so-called Islamic conquest. He said, مَتَى تَعَبَّدْتُمُ النَّاسِ وَقَدْ وَلَدَتْهُمْ أُمَّهَاتُهُمْ أَحْرَارًا. O kama qal. He said, oh Amr, since when have you started enslaving people who were born free? Since when did you start enslaving people who were born free? He gave the ethos of Islam and Islamic conquest and Islamic governance in that one line there. Muslims, wherever they may be and whoever they may rule, will always and have to always ensure that they are servants of the people, not rulers of the people. They don't enslave people in any type of government, whether it is an Islamic government or whether it's a secular government. The concept of enslaving people and taking away from them their liberties and their freedom is something which Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu practically put across by that one sentence of his. The fact that every grouping nowadays wants to be in a position of power, governmental and political authority, is creating confusion in our community. Right? If you look at Egypt, and if you look at the history of Egypt, the history of Egypt is amazing. If you look at the number of conquests and the dynasties that rule over Egypt, even in the Islamic period as well, you will see that it was fraught with difficulties, confusions, and problems. Just to give you an overview before I conclude, okay? You had the Tuluni dynasty, Ibn Tulun, Ahmed ibn Tulun, right? Who ruled by proxy in the Abbasid Caliphate. Then you had the Fatimid dynasty. People don't know the history of the Fatimid dynasty. And if you look at our situation currently and the way things are going on from an ideological perspective, where the various ideological groupings who now become political movements are now vying for power in Egypt, there is nothing new. The Fatimids were the only Shiite dynasty in Egypt. And interestingly enough, they were from the Ismaili sect. Okay? They ruled Egypt for 200 years. In the 200 years there, interestingly enough, they didn't go out there openly propagating Shiaism, because the vast majority of the people of Egypt were primarily Sunni. Okay? But they ruled Egypt for 200 years. And Islam's greatest religious institution, according to many, is Al-Azhar. Who founded it? The Fatimid dynasty. It was named after Fatima al-Zahra. Okay? Fatima al-Zahra, radiallahu ta'ala anha. Subsequent to that, after the Fatimids and so on, you had the Ayyubids. We don't know the history. Do you know Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi? Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi. Where did he create his power base from? He created his power base from Egypt itself. And there's a long history about him. Then you had the... I'm not giving it to you in chronological order, okay? You had the Mamluks, who were Turkish slaves, who ran Egypt. You had the Bahri Mamluks. You had the Burji Mamluks. Do you know a woman ruled over Egypt for plus minus 80 days? Shajaratul Dur, she was known as, the tree of pearls. Okay? And she brought in the Mamluk dynasty. Egypt has a very varied history. Right? And all of these institutions, the Ottoman Empire, Napoleon came in there in 1798, and Napoleon invaded Egypt as well. So there's been various periods in Egypt's history when there's been a great deal of turbulence, there's been a great deal of turmoil, there's been a great deal of political uncertainty. Various religious groupings have ruled at one time or the other over Egypt. Each one has had its contribution to the rich tapestry, which is the history of Egypt. But at every given time, at one time or the other, the Egyptian people and the country itself has triumphed. And what is important for us is to be able to see through the rhetoric from both sides. Right? We can't be so blinded by the fact that, you know what, people that we support ideologically, people that we support from a religious perspective, or people that we support with regards to their political views and so on, they are always in the right. We need to maintain a critical distance from those issues out there, supporting what is always haqq, truth and justice. That's all we need to do. We don't have to be necessarily blinded by our allegiance to one school of thought or to one liberationist movement, purely because, you know what, we've been brought up on the diet of that liberationist movement. I've seen it taking place here, not only for Egypt, but in various other groupings throughout the world. Right? Egypt is a wonderful country with regards to the population of Islam as well. When it comes to the constitution, people are already Muslim. There's no need to impose Sharia legally. You need to deal with when we call the fiqh of priorities. Our people have lost that concept of the fiqh of priorities. The Ikhwan need to work with the ulama of Al-Azhar. They need to work with them. They need to create strategic alliances with them. Because Egypt will not function without these ulama. Because for years, and I'm talking about for centuries, that has been the tradition. To do so would be political suicide. But someone needs to tell them these things. And people need to realize, most of our liberation movements, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in Egypt and whatever, you need to come to realize that, you know what, the struggle for freedom is one thing, and governance is something else. And our people, our liberators out there, the people who are engaging in active political engagement to ensure that justice is meted out, to ensure equality and to ensure freedom of people there, may not necessarily be the ideal people who know how to govern. Certain things which are related to bureaucracy needs to be given to the people who know the bureaucracy. We don't have to be in positions of power to be able to deal with matters which are mundane matters. We need to deal with the crucial issues there, and the rest of it should be left to those people who are most capable of doing it. Another very important matter is the fact that in Egypt itself, the population is 97% Muslim, right? Or 94.7 Muslims, depending on how I can't remember the exact statistics, okay? Right? But they have there's a great deal of tolerance amongst the Muslims there, right? There are plus minus 7 million Salafi groups, 7 million people who belong to the Salafi ideology. Right? There are plus minus 15 million who belong to the Sufi groupings. Right? You have the ulama class, you have all of these groups and so on. And Egypt has always been a center of culture and heritage and education in the Muslim community. We can't afford to lose that heritage. It was watered down quite a bit, right? With the institutionalization of Al-Azhar and so on. But it plays a very crucial geopolitical role in Islam, and we need to be au fait with the conditions that are taking place there, and we need to help in whatever way with regards to advice, with regards to this, with regards to participation and so on there. And most importantly, when it comes to any of these countries, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Egypt, or whatever it is there, remember this process is going to be a slow one. Morsi and they were never given a chance. They were never given a chance, right? And if you look at it, our condition in this country, right, 1994 is a distant memory. We still can't claim, I mean today everyone is observing the Americana disaster and tragedy. Very similar what happened to in Rabia al-Adawiya Square and so on there, right? After from 1994 to 2013, we as a new democracy, now we're teenagers in democracy, right? Haven't been able to implement this concept of democracy in its true, in a true sense. We can't expect any government to do that within the space of a year and a half. That's unfair. But at the same time, we need to come to realize that as Muslims, we need to know and we need to learn proper leadership. A very important point I want to put across, many people may not be aware of this. In the history of Islam, to my knowledge, there wasn't a single time in the history of Islam, with the exception of the Shia groupings, right, with the revolution in Iran in the 1970s, right, wherein the ulama class or the class of the clergy ever came into power. Never. Never in the history of Islam, and I'm open to correction on this one. Never in the history of Islam did the ulama take on a political position with the exception of the so-called Islamic Republic of Iran. Other than that, no one has taken on, none of the ulama have taken on that day. Why? They recognize their specific role in their communities and societies, and they played along with that role. And it is crucial for us to be able to bridge those gaps and build those bridges which various political ideologies and religious ideologies are now coming up, and we are creating this degree of thing. We can't be fighting amongst ourselves. We can't be fighting amongst ourselves. And this is very crucial because political problems ensued in Egypt whenever there was a problem between religious groupings. That is why the Ottomans and the Mamluks and every other ruling dynasty ensured that there was peace and some degree of cooperation between government, albeit a bit shaky at times.